Did you know there was a moment in Babylon when a complete stranger sat on Alexander the Great's throne wearing his crown, and the priests treated it like a death sentence for the king? Babylon, 323 BC. Alexander steps away for a short while, long enough for the throne room to feel unguarded in the way palaces sometimes are, with servants and guards who assume nobody would ever dare cross the line. Then, a man of low status, described in ancient accounts as a prisoner, walks straight to the throne, puts on Alexander's royal robe, ties the diadem around his head, and sits down quietly, like he's waiting for someone to notice. No panic, no shouting, just silence. When the guards finally react, they don't treat it like a normal crime, because in Babylon, people believed actions like this were omens, warnings sent ahead of disaster. Alexander is rushed back in, and the first question hits like a knife. Was this a message or a test run? The prisoner is interrogated, but he doesn't give them the clean answer they want. No clear mastermind, no obvious motive, only that something pushed him to do it. And then the Babylonian seers deliver the line that changes the mood in the room. This isn't about the prisoner stealing a seat, it's about the king's life. Their solution is colder than the crime itself. Kill the man who wore the crown, so the coming fate falls on him instead of Alexander. And from that moment, the countdown begins. To understand why that throne room omen felt like a warning of death, you need to understand what kind of man Alexander was. Because in 323 BC, he wasn't just a king. He was the most dangerous winner the ancient world had ever produced. He became ruler of Macedon in his early 20s, right after his father, Philip II, was assassinated. And within a few years, he used a brutal, disciplined army to smash the Persian Empire, the richest superpower on earth at the time. He defeated Persia's king, Darius, took the great cities, captured the treasuries, and kept moving. Not because he needed more land, but because he believed the world had a next edge he could reach. He went through Egypt, was treated like a liberator, then pushed deeper into Asia, until even his own soldiers, men who had survived everything, begged him to stop. By the time he returns to Babylon, he's only in his early 30s, but his empire stretches across thousands of miles, and it's held together by one thing: him being alive. That's why that stranger on the throne isn't just a weird incident, it's a nightmare scenario. Because if Alexander dies in Babylon, the question isn't who becomes king. The real question is who tears the empire apart first. Babylon was the worst place on earth for a man like Alexander to feel even slightly unsafe. Because Babylon didn't just run on politics and soldiers, it ran on signs. This was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, sitting on the Euphrates in what is now Iraq. And it had a reputation for something that sounds strange today, but was deadly serious back then: professional omen readers. The Greeks often called them Chaldeans, basically Babylon's priest scholars who watched the sky, tracked planets, and claimed they could spot danger before it arrived. And as Alexander approached the city, these men weren't giving him a vague horoscope, they were warning him directly: do not enter Babylon. Not be careful, not watch your back, just don't go in. The message reaches Alexander through his own people, and for a moment, it actually gets to him. Think about that. The man who never turned back from armies and deserts pauses because a city's priests are begging him to stay out. He even considers a compromise, camping outside the walls, delaying his entrance, choosing a safer route. But then Babylon does what Babylon always did. It pulls him in. Alexander has plans that require this city. He's thinking bigger than a victory parade. Babylon is positioned like a central hub, a place he can rule from, rebuild from, and launch new campaigns from. And that's exactly why the warning feels so heavy. Because if Alexander makes Babylon the heart of his empire, it reshapes power. It scares people who are waiting for him to leave. It threatens men around him who are quietly calculating what happens after him. And as soon as he gets close, the atmosphere turns darker. Ancient accounts describe unsettling signs, birds fighting mid-air and dropping dead near where he's moving, a kind of ugly chaos in the sky that people at the time would read like a siren. Whether those signs were coincidence, fear turning into stories, or something staged to mess with his head, the effect is the same. Babylon starts to feel like a trap that can't be seen. Quick recap before we move. Alexander enters a city obsessed with omens. He's warned not to go in. He goes anyway. And the signs begin. And right after that, inside the palace, comes the moment that takes this from superstition to straight-up nightmare. Because someone ends up wearing his crown. Inside Babylon, the tension doesn't fade. It gets sharper. Because this city treats omens like political reality. And the people who control omens here are the Chaldean priest-scholars, Babylon's elite interpreters of signs, the men kings listened to when they believed the future could be red. They've already warned Alexander not to enter. He ignored them. So now they try something more direct, something that turns fear into a scene nobody can forget. One day in the palace, while Alexander's royal clothing is set aside for a moment, a man described in the sources as low status, possibly a prisoner, suddenly appears in the throne area. He doesn't sprint, he doesn't loot. He walks straight to the most dangerous object in the empire, the throne. Then he puts on Alexander's royal robe and ties on the diadem, a simple-looking headband, but in Macedonian and Persian court culture, it's basically the public symbol that says, "This man is the king." And then he sits down and stays completely silent. That silence is what makes it terrifying. If this is just a criminal, why act like a ritual? If this is a plot, why choose the one act that screams prophecy instead of assassination? Alexander is brought in. He doesn't immediately explode. According to the tradition, he forces calm and questions the man directly. Who are you? And why would you do this? But the answer doesn't solve anything. The man doesn't reveal a clear mastermind. He doesn't confess to a network. He gives the kind of explanation that makes everyone more nervous. He claims something pushed him to do it. And now, the Chaldeans deliver the interpretation that locks the fear in place. They insist this isn't about the prisoner at all. This is about Alexander's fate. In older Mesopotamian tradition, there's an idea sometimes described as a substitute king ritual. If disaster is coming for the ruler, you symbolically place it on a substitute and then remove him, hoping the danger dies with the replacement. So the priests pressure for the cold solution. Execute the man who wore the diadem, so the omen falls on him instead of Alexander. Whether you believe the omen or not, notice what just happened. In the capital city Alexander wants to rule from, someone successfully put on his crown and sat on his throne. And the palace treated it like a countdown. And right after that, Alexander does what powerful men often do when fear starts creeping into the room. He returns to celebration, as if noise and wine can drown out prophecy. which takes us straight into the banquet where the real decline begins. After the throne room omen, Alexander does what powerful men often do when fear starts creeping in. He tries to outpace it. He throws himself back into routine, sacrifices, meetings, planning, and then a night of heavy celebration, like he's proving to everyone, and maybe to himself, that Babylon's signs mean nothing. That's when two names matter. Nearchus is his trusted admiral and longtime companion, the man who commanded Alexander's fleet and knows how the empire actually moves. Medius of Larissa is a high-status courtier from Thessaly, one of Alexander's inner circle social figures, the kind of man who doesn't just attend the king's nights, he hosts them. Alexander first holds a grand dinner for Nearchus, and later, even after taking his usual bath and preparing for sleep, he accepts Medius's invitation to continue drinking at Medius's place. In a palace full of tension, this doesn't feel like partying. It feels like Alexander choosing to keep the room full of witnesses and keeping his mind away from that empty throne. And this is where the countdown begins, because the ancient accounts all point to this banquet as the last normal moment before everything collapses. Some versions say the shift is sudden. Alexander downs a huge drink and is hit with a sharp pain, the kind that makes a conqueror stop mid-celebration and go quiet. Others say it's slower and more frightening. He drinks through the night, sleeps, and by the next day, a fever is already on him. At first small enough that he keeps acting like he'll shake it off. Either way, the pattern is the same. The king who never backed down from battle is suddenly fighting something invisible, starting in a room full of friends, laughter, and wine. Exactly the kind of place where an enemy wouldn't need an army, only timing. From the moment that banquet ends, the story stops feeling like rumor and starts feeling like a case file. Because later historians say they're pulling details from the royal diaries, basically the daily notes kept by palace scribes about where the king slept, what he did, and how sick he looked. In other words, this part isn't someone heard a story, it's written like a countdown. The first shift is subtle, which makes it more unsettling. Alexander doesn't collapse in public and end the night. He does the opposite. He tries to act normal. He bathes, performs sacrifices, eats a little, and goes to sleep with a fever already starting. The next day, he's still doing king things. He's in bed. He's talking. He's even playing dice with Medius. Medius is the well-connected court insider who keeps showing up around these final nights because he's part host, part close companion, and part political someone you keep close. But that normality is a mask. Night after night, the fever keeps returning. Then, the diary-style details get darker. Alexander is no longer walking to ceremonies. He's being carried out on his bed to do his daily religious duties. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. Even while he's being carried, he's still issuing orders like a man who expects to live. He tells officers to prepare a major expedition, some units to march by land, others to sail with him by sea. That planned campaign matters because it tells you his mind is still fighting to stay in control, which makes the question sharper. If this was poison, how is he still thinking this clearly? And if it's illness, why does it keep tightening in the exact window when Babylon's warnings were screaming, "Don't enter"? Day by day, the physical decline accelerates. He's moved from room to room, palace, river, park, back again, bathing, sacrificing, resting, then waking up worse. At first, he can still talk to his officers. Then he can only recognize them. Then he can't even do that without effort. The fever stops coming in waves and becomes constant. Finally, the moment that changes everything. Alexander recognizes the men entering his room, but he can no longer speak to them. From that point on, the king who built an empire by commanding in person becomes a silent figure on a bed, alive but unreachable. And that silence creates the most dangerous situation imaginable inside a palace: information vacuum. Because once the king can't speak, everyone starts filling the gap with their own version of reality. A rumor spreads through the army that he's already dead, and that the generals are hiding it. Outside his doors, thousands of soldiers who followed him across the world start pushing forward with one demand: let us see him. And when those doors finally open, that's where the last scene becomes unforgettable. Outside the palace doors, the Macedonian soldiers, the hardcore of Alexander's army, the men who had marched with him for years, start hearing the worst rumor possible. The king is already dead, and the generals are hiding it. That rumor is dangerous, because once an army believes its leader has died in secret, discipline collapses and panic turns into revenge. Alexander's inner circle, his senior commanders and the royal bodyguards whose job was to stay glued to him, understand what's coming next. If the soldiers don't see Alexander with their own eyes, the palace could explode into a riot. So they make a decision that tells you how bad the situation is. They open the doors and allow the soldiers to come in, not as a crowd, but in a controlled stream, one after another, so each man can confirm the truth for himself. Inside, there's no speech, no dramatic announcement, no final order. Alexander is on his bed, too weak to speak, and that silence is what makes the scene hit harder. Because these soldiers aren't coming to hear a king, they're coming to check if their world is about to collapse. The accounts say Alexander could no longer talk, but he still recognized them. As the line of men passes, he forces himself to respond in the only way he can. He struggles to lift his head, and he gives each soldier a greeting with his eyes, basically telling them, "I see you. I'm still here." The soldiers don't get answers. They don't get a reason. They just get that final confirmation. And when the last man walks out, the palace is left with the same terrifying problem as before. Alexander is alive, but he's unreachable. And now, everyone understands the real countdown isn't about rumors anymore. It's about what happens when those eyes finally stop looking back. Right after that silent goodbye, the palace goes into a kind of controlled panic, because Alexander is still breathing, but he's no longer a ruler you can consult. And the people around him aren't random servants anymore. They're his senior generals, the commanders who control the army, the treasury, and the provinces, and who all know the same brutal truth. If Alexander dies without naming a clear successor, the empire doesn't continue, it gets divided. Within a short time, the diaries-style record turns into a final line. Alexander dies in Babylon in 323 BC, still young, still at the center of everything. And then the story takes its sharpest, most unsettling turn, because the next detail isn't about politics, it's about the body. Ancient writers report that for about 6 days after his death, Alexander's body showed no visible signs of decay. Even though Babylon's climate was hot, and even though the body was reportedly left without special care, while the men around him argued over what happens next. In a world that understood death through what you could see, stiffness, discoloration, change, this was terrifying. People didn't interpret it like a medical mystery. They interpreted it like a verdict. Maybe Alexander wasn't fully human. But for you and me, that detail raises a darker question, because no decay for days can sound like a miracle, or it can sound like something else entirely. What if the palace wasn't watching a divine sign? What if they were watching a body that wasn't behaving like a body should? And nobody in that room was qualified to understand why.
What if the palace wasn't watching a divine sign? What if they were watching a body that wasn't behaving like a body should? And nobody in that room was qualified to understand why. Because in Babylon's heat, a body is supposed to change fast. So if the reports are even partly true, if Alexander's body looked untouched for days, then the mystery isn't just how he died. It's whether the people around him even knew what they were looking at. And that's why we need a suspect board. Not rumors, not fan theories, 3 files, each with a motive, each with evidence, and each with one problem that won't go away. File 1. Natural illness. Babylon was a massive river city, hot, crowded, and full of disease. Alexander had spent years on campaign. Injuries, exhaustion, constant stress, heavy drinking, and no real recovery. The ancient timeline describes a fever that doesn't vanish, weakness that gets worse day after day, and a final stage where he's conscious enough to recognize people, but too weak to speak. That progression fits a serious infection you could catch from water, food, or insects. The frightening thing about this file is that it doesn't require a perfect villain. It can happen to anyone. But here's what keeps people suspicious: the timing. The collapse begins right after that banquet, right after the warnings, right after the throne omen, like the city's prediction is coming true on schedule. File 2. Poison. This theory survives because the politics make it believable. Quick context: Alexander's inner circle wasn't just friends. These were his top generals, the men who would control everything if he died. And in a royal court, the king's wine doesn't reach him by magic. A cupbearer is literally the trusted official handling what the king drinks. So if someone wanted Alexander dead without fighting his army, the cup is the cleanest weapon. A banquet is the perfect setting: noise, distractions, witnesses, and plausible deniability. But here's the problem: Alexander doesn't drop instantly. He declines over roughly 10 to 12 days. That doesn't eliminate poison, but it forces the theory into a narrower lane. Slow-acting toxins delivered perfectly, without anyone noticing, inside a paranoid palace where one mistake means you die first. File 3. Declared dead too soon. This one exists because of that fresh body detail. If Alexander slipped into a deep paralysis or coma-like state, barely breathing, unable to move, unable to speak, ancient observers could mistake him for dead. No instruments, no modern checks, just fear, confusion, and a room full of men who needed the future decided fast. If this file is even partly true, it twists the entire ending. The silent goodbye wasn't just a king fading. It could have been a man trapped inside a body that stopped responding. But it also has a weakness. Most versions of the story still describe fever and sickness first. So this theory works best as a dark twist on top of illness, not replacing it. And here's the detail that makes all three files terrifying. Whichever explanation you choose, illness, poison, or a mistake, Alexander's condition created the same outcome inside that palace: uncertainty. And uncertainty gave the generals the one thing they needed most: time. To position themselves before the empire realized the center was gone. Now we can finally ask the only question that matters. If you had been in that room, watching the most powerful man alive disappear in slow motion, which file would you bet your life on? If we're being honest, the cleanest verdict, the one that fits the ancient timeline without forcing a perfect conspiracy, is that Alexander most likely died from a severe natural illness picked up in Babylon, made worse by years of exhaustion, injuries, and a body that had been pushed past its limits. The long, steady decline matches sickness better than it matches most instant-kill poison stories, and it explains why the people around him had time to watch him fade day by day instead of collapsing in one dramatic moment. But here's the uncomfortable part. Most likely doesn't mean certain, because the details that keep this case alive are the ones you can't fully close. The collapse begins right after a banquet in a city that warned him not to enter. A stranger wears his diadem and sits on his throne, and the priests treat it like a death sentence. Then, the body reportedly stays fresh for days, long enough for people to whisper that the king was more than human, or to wonder if the palace misunderstood what they were seeing. And that's why poison and declared dead too soon never disappear from the board. Not because they're proven, but because they're possible in a court where everyone had a motive and nobody could afford to be wrong. So I'll leave you with the darkest question in this entire story. Alexander conquered the world, but in Babylon, the world conquered him. If you had been standing inside that palace, surrounded by generals who needed him gone, priests who claimed to see fate, and soldiers demanding proof, would you fear a disease you can't see, a poison you can't trace, or the possibility that the most powerful man on earth wasn't dead when they started planning his replacement? Making videos like this takes a lot of time, researching sources, writing, and editing. So if you found this story valuable, I genuinely appreciate it if you hit like. It helps more than you think. Subscribe for more dark, suspenseful history, and drop your theory in the comments. What really happened to Alexander in Babylon?